All right. It's nice being with you again today, and we're going to get into a new subject in our literary theory exploration, and we're looking at post-structuralism today. If you recall, the last time we met, we were talking about certain facts about structuralism as a literary practice, a literary theory, a literary mode of critiquing. And by the way, it went beyond that. We began to look at how it all began as a field of inquiry from the ideas of Ferdinand de Saussure, who was looking at the organicity of language. And we talked about the fact that language for him was rather seen as a system than as a kind of practice. We mentioned certain terms that you can recall, the langue, the parole, and the like. Now, we also looked at some of the strengths of structuralism and definitely some weaknesses of structuralism. By the way, it might be amazing to know that a number of the reasons why structuralism had to be ruptured by new entries of inquiries about the field of criticism actually came from people who had been familiar with structuralism and arguably worked within structuralism, as a way of looking at literature as a signifying practice. But interestingly, a number of those that were plotting the movement of structuralism eventually began to posit a kind of interrogation, and indeed it became a headlong interrogation of structuralism from a number of reading practices that we may not say come from a particular field, but definitely they come from significant and particular ways of looking at the idea of theory, the idea of meaning, the idea of systems, and how these things, to a very great extent, might be the problems of looking at the dynamism of literature. Some of the very important criticisms that informed post-structuralism included the fact that, number one, structuralism limited the idea of meaning to an already knowable event, an already knowable issue that had the implication of the reader's immediate acknowledgement. By extension, I mean that in putting language, and in this case literature, within a systemic orbit by which you could talk about its contours, you could talk about its already known, so to speak, already known structuration, already known dimensions, already known trends and boundaries. Structuralism was, by extension, limiting literature into a singular meaning, in which, by interacting with the text, you already knew a particular meaning it signified. In other words, structuralism posited a model of literature that must be already always known in such a way that getting away from that was to get away from what was constituted as literary meaning. That definitely boxed literature into a boundary of what you can call a metaphysics. When we talk about a metaphysics, we are talking about a kind of arrangement, a kind of systemic technology of knowing ideas, of knowing labels, of knowing issues that had to do with society and cultural production. By talking about metaphysics, you're talking about, the containment of essence, the containment of truth, the containment of identity, and to a very great extent, the containment of reality itself. So literature became a position of already known segments of what it means to be literary and also what meaning means within literature. But also within that kind of scenario, literature became a kind of work in which you signified something that was absolutely binary. By being able to talk about the levels of meaning in terms of a structure of verbal items, the relationships of those sign items within the signifying system, by being able to group certain words together as meaning a particular thing through deduction. Literature had already become something that could be already interpreted even before meeting it. In fact, a critic talks about literature as reducing to a mere display of commentary. When you look at what people like Michel Foucault says about literature, you will see that by making literature already positioned within a meaning-making universe via the structuralist criticism it got posited in, you had already made commentary on literature. And by making commentary, you are making the actual story, the actual narrative of literature secondary to itself. In other words, the commentary you make on literature from a positional point of structuralist meaning making already made literature not only a subject, but it made it an object. By extension, the commentary now becomes the position of the narrative reality, while literature becomes secondary in its communicative value. In other words, by bringing a commentary that was fixated within a particular meaning structure coming from structuralism, the meaning of literature becomes the commentary itself, while literature becomes a fiction to itself. In other words, the narrative by excellence that structuralism presents, it's no more a narrative about the literature. It's no more a critique of the literature. It is another creation, another fiction coming from the idea, the metaphysics of science, linguistic science, that was brought in through the technology, the systemics of structuralism. Another thing you will find within this kind of position, of structuralist position, is that we have a kind of scenario in which the contours of identity become already determined. In other words, there is no way of looking at it beyond the lenses of the structuralist. One of the people that have been very crucial to a post-structuralist analysis of literature was actually Roland Barthes himself. And in the kind of position he began to make in certain writings he wrote within his post-structuralist phase of intellectual dissemination, included, write-ups like SZ. He also wrote The Death of the Author, okay? He also reflected a lot about what he called textuality. We are coming to that later. But, in talking about his movement from looking at a model of meaning through a structuralist criticism of literature, a structuralist theorizing and criticism of literature, into a junction where you find out that meaning is allowed to claim its textuality in literature. I'm coming to that, okay? He was saying that he got to a kind of crisis that, somebody like Michel Foucault would call the crisis of versus, the crisis of binary opposition. It came to a point where he began to see that meanings in literature went beyond mere definition, that meaning in literature didn't come from the position of theorizing as a fixated thing, as a way in which you created the absolute truth of something. That meaning came rather through staging of positional meanings that the text will adhere to when you look at these perspectives on its own. And along that line, he moved away from a structuralist analysis of narratives to SZ, where he began to look at the textuality of the text. The moment he began to look very seriously and eventually move beyond that into the main orbit of what he saw as the text textuality. And what do post-structuralists mean by that? When a post-structuralist talks about a text, like the literary text, the post-structuralist is not just talking about the text as a kind of publication, as a kind of something rolled out, something unified that the audience, the reader, okay, will already know as a literary text coming from a particular literary meaning. No. Rather, the text deploys a kind of, from its etymology, coming from a Greek source, okay, the text actually has the idea of strands of textures, strands of particular threads that when you tease these strands out very, very carefully, you will see that there are affiliates in their several strands that actually come together to become that woven element you can call a kind of cord, okay, or a kind of strip. Now, if that woven element, that singular strand that we see as a thread, were just given to you in a particular color, you will find out that you see it as just a singular thing. But then, if it were to manifest in its plurality, even though in one position of a particular thread, when it comes out in its plurality, that is, when it is allowed to untangle itself and give us the several dimensions by which it becomes a text, you will find out that it is composed of several kind of different elements that come together. Let's imagine that those strands are in different colors. One is in green, another is in purple, another is in red, another is in white, and you are to find the combination of these colors in this singular thread. Nothing will tell you that this thing is just singular. You will find out that you are able to look at its several shades of presentation that gives the texture of imaginativeness, okay, of artistry to the particular strand or thread you are looking at. So, in looking at the text, post-structuralists look at its textuality. In other words, the several meanings, the several possibilities of meanings that are woven into it through the dynamics of reader and textual interactions. So the interaction of the imaginative element and the reader produces the text textuality. And one thing about the text textuality is that it does not have a uniform meaning. Actually, like Barbara Johnson says, a formidable post-structuralist that passed on not quite long, about a decade or so ago, Barbara Johnson talks about the difference of the text. She says that the text difference is not the difference it claims as a self-contained element, as different from another self-contained element we all roughly call text. Like, for example, I'm trying to distinguish between William Shakespeare's Othello from his Macbeth. Or I'm trying to see the difference between the post-colonial reflections of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, comparing it with R.K. Narayan's A Horse and Two Goats. No, that the text difference is not actually the elemental, the concrete difference of a particular story or the particular publication of a text or the story of a particular text different from another. No. According to Barbara Johnson, which she actually lifts from post-structuralists that come before her, people like Michel Foucault himself, the later Roland Barthes, the one I'm talking about now, who is the post-structuralist, or people like Pierre Macheret. Pierre Macheret is a post-structuralist and a Marxist as well. People like Jacques Derrida, people like Jacques Lacan, okay? She says in a very, very encapsulating language that a text difference is not in the element of looking at how this story of the text differs from that story of another text as a unified whole, but that a text difference actually is indifferent to itself. What does she mean? A text difference is indifferent to itself. It means that there are several reading practices that warrant the textuality of the text. That is, the several plural possibilities of meanings that can be read into particular signifying, elements of reading coming from a reader as different from another reader. And in other words, when we are multiple in the way we want to look at the dimensions of meaning in a text, we can come from several sources of knowledge. Okay, for example, I might want to look, for instance, at the possibilities of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, for example, as, for example, a text premised on hegemonic masculinity. Somebody else will look at it as an anthropological rememorialization of the pre-colonial Igbo world before its encounter with Western modernity. A feminist, like I told us some time back, a feminist like Florence Stratton will look at Things Fall Apart as a hyper-masculinist text, okay, that reduces the female body in the Igbo world as perpetually erased or perpetually, at best, marginalized within Igbo cosmic view, Igbo production of knowledge, Igbo communality, and also the Igbo aspiration to modernity in future. We can also look at Things Fall Apart to a very great extent as a play of several shades of masculinity. For example, if you look at the kind of masculinity, the hegemonic masculinity that people like Okonkwo aspires to and recognized by, honored by within the Igbo world of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, you will discover that it's not the same kind of male that somebody like his father can be brought into. His father happens to be, to Chinua Achebe, a failed specimen of maleness because he is not a person that inscribes the issues that are fundamental in the idea of Igbo prosperity, looked at from a masculinist gaze within the Igbo world of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. So, the textuality of the text is indifferent to itself. In other words, the complications and the dynamics of different meanings that are traceable or that are decipherable within the text. By extension, post-structuralism defies the regime of singular meaning making. In fact, it goes beyond the idea of theory. One of the problems that post-structuralism tries to confront is the binary opposition as practiced by transcendental theories that limit the meaning of literature within a particular reading lens into what post-structuralism itself will posit the necessity to look at the plural dimensions of literature. In other words, post-structuralism goes beyond the binary opposition of theory and practice and weaves theory and practice into several dynamic fluid elements of meaning production. By extension, meaning is taken away from the orbits of theoretical boundary into the space of meaning staging. It goes beyond the idea of meaning imputation as a particular element of the meaning into the staging of meanings. Literature and criticism, now metamorphosis and theory, moves from a particular way of looking into staging. By staging, it means that one, meaning is not absolute, it is temporal. Number two, meaning is not final, it is rather tentative. Number three, meaning is not a continuum, it is rather a series of discontinuities that can be read into how new shades of ideas intersect previous shades of ideas that make us to see several levels of how we can interrogate the text. Another thing post-structuralism actually defines for us is that there is an impossibility of defining even post-structuralism itself, because post-structuralism itself operates within an orbit of heterogeneity of new ways of looking at the democratization of knowledge, the the heterogeneity of looking at the particular plurality of meaning from other shades of meaning making. And along that line, a very crucial way in which a very seminal critic of post-structuralism, Michel Foucault, brings about or problematizes structuralism is by looking at the position of the binary opposition presentation of language meaning as being within the sphere of the long and the parole. If you remember, the long is the system of language that allows us to look at the relationship between the signifier and the signified. The signifier being the phonic image that a language presents, and while the signified is the concept that that phonic image presents, aligns with to give us the sign. For Ferdinand de Saussure, if you remember, the long is a compartment of a technology of language system or linguistic system that allows us to be able to already know the structures, the elements of language, or the elements of anything that can be aligned to the signs of the sign system. That is, anything that can be brought into the way in which we can bring a structuralist reading into it. Okay? Now, the lang is the system, while the parole is the practicing, the application by knowledge of that language system into actual use in society. And that has to do with our personalities, our subjectivities, how people, how individuals use language. Now, for Ferdinand de Saussure, there is a binary opposition. There is a binary system of looking at how meaning is recognized in meaning production of any verbal event, just like literature. But Michel Foucault intercepts in a very interesting way and questions how Saussure ignores the element of discourse as a linguistic activity. By discourse, Michel Foucault was talking about a way in which language plays within particular signifying systems that reveal its interpenetration with things like politics, for example, or sports, or religion, or academic production in such a way that when you begin to hear or you begin to perceive the use of language within these discourses, within these particular topics that language is involved in, and how power play is generated within this use of language, you see that it goes beyond just the elemental of a particular thing called long and then parole. And what is parole? For example, somebody like Michel Foucault will tell you that parole is endless. Parole is endless, but parole can be looked at within discursive units of production. Discursive units that have to do with a particular cultural, political, social dynamics that the language is used within, in which the language is involved in. So, the element of discourse, according to Michel Foucault and so many other post-structuralists, breaks away the idea of single or definable metaphysical meanings that structuralism brings about to readers to acknowledge. One other thing I want us to take very careful look at, is the idea of the elimination of the author, not in the sense actually that structuralism ignores the author, but the idea by which the author cannot claim dominance of meaning over a text. And along that line, a critic like Roland Barthes, wrote a very memorable, viral, canonical write-up. Forgive me, I'm talking about canonical in a post-structuralist lecture. No. What I mean is that very, very celebrated writing, which he calls the death of the author. The death of the author doesn't mean the physical death of the author, definitely. It is a kind of metaphor that talks about the inability of an authorial determination to give the reader the meaning of the text. In other words, the author is dead as far as the several textual productions of literature manifest themselves. Okay, and then the death of the author definitely allows the interplay of the several textualities of various singular texts when brought within the laboratory of meaning making. We also need to know that post-structuralism also presents a scenario where we have a context of the end of the signified, so rather the endless liveliness of the signifier. So the signifier has endless multiple signifieds. In other words, for example, if I talk about the chair, I might be talking about such a thing like I'm sitting on. I might also be referring to, if you like, the head of a particular knowledge unit within a university, maybe the head of a department. I could also be referring within several contexts of what a chair could mean. I could also be referring to the activity of claiming responsibility about things. But beyond even that, a signifier like professor within a text. For example, there is a professor that is the best brain in a particular field, like for example in math, okay, or in physics or chemistry or literature, and is eulogized, is even probably fetishized as a professor among his colleagues in a literary text. But at the same time, that professor, being perhaps a male that always seems to assert his position when speaking, might also give a secondary meaning of a particular embodiment of masculine knowledge production that plays down the participation of the female body, okay, within the meaning production of the field is talking about or the field is involved in. Professor may also be plural within that text. For example, if that professor was interacting with a village head, maybe somebody that didn't have the opportunity of going to school, Western education school, but is revered within his clan as a sage, somebody who is seen as a wise man who gives counsels and so many other things like that. And they come together. This one is coming with native knowledge. And the one thing as professor is coming with a rationalist mind, actually pumped in by facility to Western education. There could be a way in which a text might want to satirize, okay, the claims of either of those knowledge producers as ultimate, while the professor might not recognize the intricacies of how people relate the cosmos with metaphysical, unscientifiable elements like spirits or fairies and all that. But this other professor is very much versed in that and can tell you that, the moment you have an experience like this, it means that a particular physical thing, empirical thing, will be happening in your family in a week's time. And people have been seeing that as always happening. It's not a play of psychology now. It's something that is already known within that society as almost always happening. But the professor wants to break it down to things like superstition, okay? It is just a kind of situation when an anthropological society is bound up by myth, and then they are so much embroiled within myth, okay, that it shows how, just like Claude Lévi-Strauss will put it, it shows how the elements of myth, come together to direct or to naturalize the existence of certain people within that myth culture. You will discover that professor becomes no more singular. It becomes open to several meanings. And then there are people within this particular textual narrative that are trying to talk about difference. For instance, maybe there is a female in her 20s who seems to have a mind of her own, who is querying the fixings of understanding of meaning coming from the professor of the university and the professor of the village, and she's trying to claim what we call agency, a kind of right to posit the way you see the world and you want to impress to the world in front of you. You will discover that professorship becomes very, very open-ended in meaning production. So a post-structuralist will look at issues and look at the several dimensions of meaning that a text or a cultural product or a particular incident can produce among several stakeholders within society. We are coming back to post-structuralism in another way of reading by talking about more particularities that came from particular authors, particular thinkers within post-structuralism, and then perhaps link this to other theories that we have looked at so far to make it something we begin to look at as very much open-ended for us to enjoy several forms of meaning production. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that you must have at least started our journey into post-structuralism. I guess we are going to have about one more lecture at least in this area, okay? But please don't forget to like this channel. Don't forget to invite your colleagues, your community, as the case may be. Don't forget to endorse it, to like it, to share it, okay? Drop your questions, drop your opinions. Let's converse. Thank you very much. We'll meet next time.